Hello everyone, and welcome back to episode 4 of my chess series. In this one, I'm going to be opening similar to the game I showed you in my second episode. This is the opening as black that gets your queen out early. Since then, I've played it a few more times. I've played against it a few more times, which actually proved to be more informative than playing as black. And you'll see the moves that proceed past move 4 follow a system. In chess theory, there are systematic openings, which are essentially ways to play that get all of your pieces developed onto the board in a generally safe and sound way. You're going to see him move his knight out to f3, and I'm going to follow by developing one of my pieces as well. I developed my bishop to f5. And the reason that you want to develop your bishop before your knights in this opening is because there are a couple of pawn moves that are essential when doing the Scandinavian defense. Apparently that's the name when you bring your queen out on move 2. It's called the Scandinavian. When you move your queen out to the edge of the board to a5, that's just known as the a5 variation. Great chess grandmasters have played this way. Ben Finegold's dad was known for playing the Scandinavian this way. And you'll see most people move their queen just back to its original position when they play the Scandinavian. I personally prefer moving your queen out to the edge because it creates a sharper position that your opponent probably hasn't played against much. So after I develop my bishop, he develops his own bishop, checking my king. I move my pawn up one space to block this, and not only does the pawn block this attack and counterattack the bishop, but it also opens that diagonal for my queen. In the second episode, you'll see me move my pawn up 2 spaces, and it serves the same utility of opening that diagonal for the queen. So by move 3, when your queen is on the edge, it's a very rudimentary idea to get that backwards diagonal opened very soon, because they will start to try to attack your queen, and I think in this match you'll see that happen eventually. So he moves his bishop back. I decide to push my other pawn up 1 space. And these 2 pawn moves I actually saw my opponent use when I played as white. If you want to test an opening and see the correct next moves, try playing as the opposite color and test your opponent to see what they do. The main reason that I have a better understanding of the Scandinavian opening is because I played against it to test it and see what your opponent would typically play. And I noticed that moving these pawns up 1 space is very important. So he castles, I continue to develop, pushes his pawn up, and at this point, I spot a tactic. If I attack his knight right now, he either has to move his knight or defend his knight, and his knight is currently defending his bishop. So if I can trade his knight for my bishop, I can then take his bishop out with my queen. So I decide to develop my bishop before developing my other knight. He spots my idea, and to avoid this, he just moves his bishop. I decide to develop my knight. At this point, I think I've reached the limits of this system that I understand. I think from here on out, you can decide which way you'd like to castle your king. He decides to develop his bishop. I decide to push my knight up. He pushes his rook out to the open file. Now I castle. Now he pushes his pawn up to attack my knight. So I trade my knight for his bishop. He decides to take with his a-pawn, opening the file for his rook. Now my queen is under attack. And I have to move my queen back, but I have to be careful of where I move my queen to. I decide to go to d8. And you might wonder, why not move your queen to c7? On that diagonal, it's targeting that pawn that he has on h2. If I were to move my queen to c7 or b6, he can move his knight to d5. And with his knight at d5, he would be attacking my queen with his knight, but he would also be attacking my undefended bishop with his bishop. So at this point, it's important to understand that while I have to move my queen, it's going to leave my bishop undefended. My queen is currently defending my bishop. It's important to keep all of your pieces defended. And if you're going to move your piece to a spot where your other piece is now undefended, you need to account for the following moves and what your opponent might play. So he moves his knight to e4. It seems almost innocuous. I could take his knight out with my bishop. I could take his knight out with my knight. But I still have this undefended bishop. So to get rid of that, I decide to trade bishops. Rather than taking my bishop, he decides to check me and take my knight, so I take his knight. I probably spent the longest amount of time on this move. Typically, you don't want to take with the pawn because it would double up your pawns. It's going to leave your king a little bit undefended in the corner. If you were to take with your queen, you develop your queen. But in this case, I'm looking at his king and I'm considering checkmate ideas. And I'd like to open that file, and I'd like to move my rook to that open file. and hopefully attack that pawn with 2 different pieces. So I decide to take with my pawn. He takes my bishop with his queen, and now I have to be wary of his queen moving to this open file, checking my king. Currently I have almost the entire file defended. The g5 square is defended with my pawn. The g6 square is defended with 2 pawns. The g4 square is defended with my bishop. So my king is currently safe. So there's no reason for me to hurry with my idea to move that rook to the open file. I have this idea that I can use in the future. So I'm looking at other ideas to improve my position, and I think I want to attack his knight with my bishop. If I can take his knight out right now, he would take back with his pawn, and then he has a vulnerable king on this open file as well. He decides to defend his knight with his rook, so it is at this point that I want to get my rook into my own open file. I move my king to the corner, and I have to consider my vulnerable pawn on f6. If he can get his queen to f6, he can check my king, but currently my queen is defending that square. So he pushes his pawn up, attacking my bishop. It's at this point I decide to trade my bishop for his knight. So he decides that he doesn't want to take back with his pawn. He doesn't want to double his pawns and make his king more vulnerable, but at this level, that allows me to overload his pawn. You'll see me move my rook to the open file on g8. He pushes his pawn up 1 space, and I'm not entirely sure why he decides to do this. Maybe he thinks it improves his position. Maybe it's a waiting move to see what I'm going to do next. I decide to move my queen up to d5. Now it's attacking his rook. His rook seems to be defended by his pawn, and he decides to just move his pawn up to b4. What he's not considering is that his pawn is now overloaded. I can take his rook, and he can't take my queen back. If he was to take my queen, well then I could take his king out with my rook. You can't expose your king like that. It's an illegal move. You can't put yourself into check on your move, so he can't take back with his pawn. So because his pawn is defending his king, he can't move the pawn out of the file, and I can take his rook out. This is one of those positions that looks safe initially, but you have to think further and consider all of your opponent's threats against you. So I take his rook out with my queen, and at this point my opponent resigns. In the very next match, I end up winning with the exact same idea to overload one of his pawns. So I hope you guys found this video informative. Overloading pieces is a viable play at the 1300s rating. And with this knowledge, I'm going to go ahead and try to work my way up to 1400, maybe 15 in the future. Only time will tell. Thanks for watching.